Well, I was involved with starting Dismas House in 1986. The person that we consider the founder of Dismas in Vermont, her name is Rita McCaffrey, and she was organizing people. So we're talking about like 1985, and she was organizing people to open a Dismas House. She had heard about Dismas House through some connections, but there was a Catholic priest in Nashville, Tennessee, who had started the first Dismas House with Vanderbilt University students. And so she had been in touch with that organization, and they were going to support her in creating a new Dismas House in Vermont. This would have been the first Dismas House outside of the state of Tennessee. And so anyway, I knew about her through my then wife was a professor at Trinity College, which no longer exists, but was a women's college in Burlington. And Rita was an alum of Trinity College, so like that was a natural place for her to get support. So I found out about it through that connection and got involved in the planning stages of Dismas House. One of the things I think about Dismas House is that it's very labor intensive. There are a lot of volunteers who work or get involved at Dismas House and do a lot of things for Dismas House. And also, Dismas houses have been opened by volunteers. So it's not like, there's this individual or even just a few people who would say, hey, let's just open a bunch of Dismas houses. It's much more grassroots than that. That takes community organizing. And it takes, a year or to 2 years usually, or even longer, to open a Dismas house. So Dismas houses have tended to open in a very gradual way. We've been here for 40 years and we've opened 5 Dismas houses. So that's not a lot over, a long span of time like that. But it reflects, I think, that sense of, that this really involves people in the community, and it takes a lot of grassroots kind of organizing to make that happen. So to me, that's one of the challenges of our organizational structure, but there's a beauty to that too, because it means that people in the community are invested in this project. And over the course of all these, about 40 years now, I've seen many programs for people who are either in prison or coming out of prison come and go, right? Because they were started by the Department of Corrections or by, it was somebody's brainchild. And so they opened a program, and then 4 or 5 years later, since it was not like this group of people gathered together to make this thing happen, it was the product of one person or just a few people or an agency or whatever, and then the leadership changes, and when the leadership changes, they have different priorities, so those programs go away. But I think the stability of Dismas House is directly attributable to the investment of ordinary people in the community. So one of my roles over the years was to train, right. I sat in on a lot of interviewing of new house directors and things like that, and then did some training. Not everyone, but for the most part, a lot of the folks in Vermont I did. I had some background in working in shelter for homeless people and running a soup kitchen, But not, it was just like I did it because I believed in it, not because I was a trained professional. And came to Dismas because, again, not because I was a trained social worker or trained in corrections and stuff like that. I came to Dismas because I believed in the mission. And, and obviously I had the skills necessary to do the work. So I think because I had some experience working with the homeless population, with people coming to eat in a soup kitchen or stay in a homeless shelter, there was a fair number of, that part of the population, were people who had been incarcerated. So before getting involved with Dismas, I had some sense of the needs and struggles of people coming out of prison. But it was still, something where I had to learn a lot, when I first got involved. And I didn't know that much about the prison system itself. So there was, there was definitely a learning curve. A big change from when we first started. People who came to live at Dismas House, people who were incarcerated, were for the most part struggling with alcohol. Some people, there was cocaine and some other drugs, but it was mostly, people struggling with alcohol. So part of, their being successful and staying out of prison, was going to AA meetings and dealing with alcohol. Now, it's not that has completely disappeared, but now it's much more about, the drugs that, everybody's aware of. And that is a different thing. It's a different dynamic. It's a different struggle, and people in recovery are, getting in maintenance programs as opposed to going to AA meetings for the most part. I'm not saying no one goes to meetings, but that's a fairly different thing, and it's a fairly different dynamic in the house also. It just, it's much more, I think, destructive now than alcohol. I mean, it's not that alcohol wasn't destructive in people's lives. I mean, it was a big part of why they were in prison, so it wasn't helping them. But being able to come out of prison and do well, I think, is harder now. So I grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, French Canadian family, both, like both sides, my parents, and which also means Catholic. And but when I, after high school, I went to the Air Force Academy. So, I wanted to serve my country, and was able to go to the Air Force Academy. I graduated from the Air Force Academy, but while I was there, I started to develop convictions that sort of led me to believe that, at least possibly being responsible for, nuclear warfare, was just not something I could do. And I ended up leaving the Air Force for conscience reasons. And I had influences, or, it was like I sort of was, struggling with those issues. I mean, I liked being in the Air Force. I liked being in the military. But for the whole issue of, having to kill people, or at least potentially. And, so people like, so we're talking about mid 1970s now, so it was a long time ago, right? But Martin Luther King was a pretty big influence on that. Nonviolent resistance, Gandhi. In the Catholic Church, there was a woman named Dorothy Day who operated soup kitchens and shelters in New York City, but was strongly opposed to war. Was a pacifist. So even though I was in the Air Force, I was starting to be really influenced by some of these folks, and so and another person was Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk. He was an author of books and a commentator on like what was happening around war, Vietnam, race relations, all these kinds of things. So when I left the military, I thought, and felt like this calling to become a monk. So I actually joined a Trappist monastery in Western New York, so I was probably there for about a year, but altogether, I was actually there 2 different times. But in the end, I felt like, I really wanted to have in my life children and things like that, a married life with children, and you can't do that if you're a Trappist monk, right? So, because celibacy and you live in the monastery and that's it when you're a monk, right? So, so I left there and went back home, and that's when I got involved in first volunteering but then started operating the soup kitchen in Manchester, New Hampshire, and then I started working at the shelter, and I lived in the shelter. Like I had an apartment in the shelter, and where people would come and stay overnight, right? Homeless folks in Manchester. But then I got married, and my ex-wife was a professor, and got a job teaching at Trinity College. So that's how we ended up coming up to Burlington. Mm. And I think I had mentioned earlier that it was through that connection through Trinity College that I met Rita McCaffrey, who was interested in organizing Dismas. And so it was very appealing to me. I had, at the time, I was working part-time at the way station, which is one of the local shelters for homeless folks. So it was something that was very interesting to me, and I was really drawn by sort of the mission, the philosophy of Dismas. I loved that it was like this grassroots kind of thing, that it was just like, it wasn't a group of professionals who had been to college and studied corrections or law enforcement, but rather it was just ordinary people who believed in this mission, and the mission was to reconcile former prisoners with their community, right? And that sort of fit with all these convictions that I had, right? The way I think about it is, when a person commits a crime, they're doing something that does a harm to their community, as well, oftentimes to an individual or a business. There's some specific victim, but in addition to that, they're harming their community, because we're all affected by the reality of crime in our community, right? We lock the doors to our apartments or dorm rooms or our car out of concern that somebody else might take what belongs to us, right? And if nobody did that, if no one stole things, then we wouldn't do that. But, because we would have no fear of losing something that belongs to me, right? But that's just an example of how, we're all affected. Even when we're not the direct victim of an assault or a burglary or, of stealing, our behaviors, the way we think about the world, it affects all of us. So when a person, commits a crime, they're harming their community as well as individuals. And as a consequence, right, we have a system of justice to kind of deal with that, right, to apprehend the person who committed the crime and to mete out some consequence like prison, right? You steal something, the police arrest you, you go to court, the judge sentences you, off you go to prison for 2 years. So a person gets sentenced, right? And so they're removed from their community and they're placed in this building that we call prison. In Vermont, we call them correctional facilities. But it's the same as prison. So that, where they are, we're not, and where we are, they're not. Right? So there's a physical separation that divides us from them. But that division is not just a physical one. We also use language to divide us from them, right? There's us, the good people of society, of the community, and there's them, the bad people, and we give them a label like convict and criminal, right? And when a person is incarcerated, and this happens to a more or less degree, depending on each individual person's internal makeup and so on, but a fairly common thing that happens when a person's incarcerated is they start internalizing those messages. So not only do we apply a label to them, they apply that label to themselves. In other words, they become a convict or a criminal in their own mind. And the truth about being a convict or a criminal is that you're not like everybody else, right? So when a person's sentence is complete or they're ready to be released from the community, right, they pass through, the gate that separates the incarcerated side of the building from the rest, the community side, right? And so transitioning through making that physical transition from inside to outside, that's easy. You just walk through the door. But what's not so easy, it was the part that you internalized, right? That part of being different than everybody else. So now you're a fish out of water. And now you're going into a place where everybody hates you, right? Because you're a convict and you're a criminal. And all the messages that you get is that nobody wants you. They don't want you in their neighborhood. They don't want you as their neighbor. They just want you to stay away, right? And that makes getting out of prison incredibly anxiety producing. It's a really scary thing. So, and there's a guy who came to live here at this house who I think put it perfectly. He said, when I first got out of prison, I felt like I was coming to a regular house in a regular neighborhood, but I was not a regular person, right? So there's that sense of alienation, that of being an alien, right? And an alien is someone who does not belong, right? So the mission of Dismas then, and the key word in our mission statement is reconciliation. We do provide housing, but actually housing is not a word in our mission statement. Our mission statement says The mission of Dismas is to reconcile former prisoners with society and society with former prisoners. Now we do that by providing a place for people to live as they are transitioning out of prison. But the most important thing, and the thing that appealed to me, the thing that drew me to get involved at Dismas, the thing that kept me at Dismas for 40 years, was the mission of reconciliation, was to heal a broken relationship, right? So that a person, this same person that I was talking about, when it was time for him to leave, he was able to say, well, I guess I'm a part of society now, right? But he was able to experience that because while he lived here, he ate dinner on a nightly basis with people from the community who came here as volunteer cooks, right? So, and you probably have talked about this or understand that one of the main things that happens at Dismas House is the evening meal, that we eat dinner together Monday through Friday. But it's not just about the people who live in the house eating dinner together. We have volunteers from the wider community who come in as volunteer cooks. And I'm not sure if you've had that opportunity. So you've been to the evening meal. Okay, yeah. So you know what I'm talking about. Okay. And were there volunteer cooks when you came? Okay, excellent. So the way I think about it is when that volunteer cook shows up with their evening meal, right? Even before they open their mouth to engage a person living in the house in conversation, they are communicating an incredibly important and powerful message. They're saying, I care enough about you that I will enter into relationship with you, right? Because what happens at the dinner table isn't just about eating a meal, it's about entering into relationship. Relationship happens around the dinner table. And because people enter into relationship, then they are receiving a message that says, you are accepted, not the message, which is the opposite of the message of incarceration, which is you are rejected. We reject you. We separate ourselves from you. We cut you off from us. At the dinner table, it's the opposite, right? We welcome you. We enter into relationship with you. Right? We care about you. And so, to me, that's the mission of Dismas House. And to me, that mission is powerful enough, at least for myself, that I could do that same thing, to be a house director, to sit at that dinner table for 40 years, right? So that's my story. The more traditional approach to dealing with, it's like, oh, here we have an issue of people leaving prison and coming to, and people are coming back to live in the community again, right? I think one of the ways in which, people think about that, is like it's a social work problem. And it's about mental health, and we need to get the right experts involved to give them the right kind of counseling and professional support to transition out of prison. But the people sitting at that table are not psychiatrists and doctors or social workers. They're ordinary people. And to me, that's the beauty of Dismas, is that it's something anybody can do, right? Like at our house in Winooski, for a while we had, as volunteer cooks, a mother who would prepare the meal. She came in with her 2 young children and her mother, right? So we had 3 generations of that family joining us at our dinner table. And they were all, whether they were 3 years old or 86 years old, they were all engaged in accomplishing the mission of Dismas because they all entered into relationship with people sitting at that table. And that's something that you just can't do if you're just approaching this as a professional kind of problem that requires specialized techniques and specialized training, and because then you just have to hire specialists to do it. There is another group where it's like they gather together ordinary folks, just volunteers, in other words, to meet together with people and to provide direct support to people coming out of prison, right? So here in Vermont, in the Burlington area, and so that's like that to me. Like that's something that is similar to the mission of Dismas, right? Because it's engaging just ordinary people in the community. But that's not, to me, my concern is that's not the ordinary way we as a society tend to deal with things. Our ordinary way of wanting to deal with things is by getting the professionals involved, right? And especially in corrections related, it's all about specialists. The police are specialists. The lawyers are specialists. The corrections people are specialists, right? They get training to do this very specialized thing. And what we're doing is not a specialist thing. It's ordinary people doing this thing. And I think there's something directly related to our mission. The mission of reconciliation is happening because ordinary people are engaged in doing it, right? So in other words, a person isn't being treated. They're entering into relationship. So I think that's one of the things that makes Dismas kind of unique. And also I think it serves the community by giving ordinary people in the community an opportunity to engage in relationship with someone coming out of prison. Whereas, if like all the programs that somebody was coming out of prison was going to were, like treatment programs or, counseling type programs, those are not being run by just ordinary folks. They're being run by specialists. And I'm not saying that those are bad things. People are helped by those things. It's more of both and than, this is better than that. It's just that I think there's not a lot of what we do that happens outside of the context of Dismas. The basic thing for a person who's graduating from the Air Force Academy is that you would go to pilot training afterwards, right? So that's, like Air Force Academy, like West Point or Annapolis, it's like that's going to college, right? So 4 years, it's about studying in a military, you're getting military training and stuff. But it's after you graduate that you then go do whatever you're going to do in the Air Force, like fly a fighter or fly a bomber, right? And you go to flight school, and then you're assigned. Okay, you're going to go then. Now you learn how to fly in general, but now you're going to go learn how to fly an F-16, which is a fighter, or a B-52, which is a bomber. And you don't really get to pick and choose what you want to do. So I had to make a choice while I was still at the Air Force Academy that it's like, if I choose to continue on this path and go through pilot training, I could be assigned to be flying bombers that have nuclear payloads and be directly responsible for dropping a nuclear bomb on somebody, on a million people, right? And and that just, one of the things that, also happened at the same time while I was at the Air Force Academy was, sort of developed my faith, that led me to question, can I do this? And eventually coming to believe that I can't do this. One of the relationships that we had, from the very earliest days, and it was a relationship that was through Rita McCaffrey, right, who's the founder of Dismas, and her husband Frank McCaffrey. And that's a whole story in itself, which I think you'll probably be getting into. But Frank was a judge, and but they had a connection with monks at Weston Priory, which is in Vermont, and the monks were very supportive of anything Rita and Frank were doing, really, but in helping get Dismas House get started. And actually, they gave us an interest-free loan that enabled us to buy this house. But also, as monasteries tend to do, they had guest houses, and so we would go on a regular basis. Usually, in the winter, we would go on a weekend trip. Everybody at Dismas House would go down to Weston Priory and for the weekend. And it wasn't a religious thing, but it was, for them, it was a matter of hospitality, offering hospitality to us, right? And but it was an opportunity for us to get away from Burlington, just to go and for people living in the house to be away from their work or whatever, and just relax and have fun. And in the wintertime, when we went, we would go sliding, and because there was a big hill right next to where we were staying, or we would go cross-country skiing or things like that. But that was, those were really, bonding times for people living in the house, and people would remember that, and have pictures, take pictures of the group pictures and things like that. So it was a lot of fun. But that was a very, that connection with the monks at Weston Priory was very important. The name Dismas itself, it comes from Saint Dismas, who was on the story of the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross, right? There are two criminals, at least that's, legend. It's not a biblical thing. You're not going to read this in the Bible, right? But, ancient Christian legend has it that, there were two criminals who were crucified next to him. And Jesus has a conversation with one of them repents, and Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise," right? Well, the church gave the name of that person, or gave that person the name Dismas. So in the there's a Saint Dismas. So Dismas, the good thief. And so that's where that name comes from. Okay, so that's just an aside on where the name Dismas comes from. Yeah. But in the mid-1970s, a Catholic priest named Father Jack Hickey was a chaplain at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and he had organized Vanderbilt University students to do volunteer work in the Tennessee State Prison, which was one of those fortress-type prisons that, like when you see in the movies, this penitentiary is like massive structure, with high walls and the barbed wire and all that kind of stuff. That's what this was, right? But he organized students to go into the prison And they did things that a volunteer might typically do in a prison setting, like literacy, academic stuff, maybe played volleyball and basketball, that kind of stuff. But one of the things they did from time to time was just sit around like in a circle and just talk, right? So they got to know men who were incarcerated. This is the men's prison I'm talking about. And so they recognized in getting to know the men who were incarcerated that, when it was time for them to get out, some men had a place to go. They had a home to go to. And if that was the case, that home probably meant that there was either parents and siblings there or spouse and children. As you can imagine, those two things would tend to go together, right? A home and some group of people, right? If a person goes to prison for 2 years, if you're living in a house or an apartment by yourself, you probably are not maintaining that 2 years later, right? So if they have a home to go to, it's because there's community there, there's family, right? But they recognize, some men had a home to go to and the supportive community when it was time for them to get out of prison. But there were other men who had no place to go, who had no home to go to, and no support of community, no family to support them as they transitioned out of prison. And so they thought, well, if we could find a place big enough so that people coming out of prison could live there, but some of us would be living there too. This house that we could get would be like the home that they don't have, and we could be like the family that they don't have if some of us are living there. And so they thought, good idea. Let's see if we can make that happen. Father Jack started preaching in churches all around Nashville and then all around Tennessee to raise money to buy a house. And he was a very good preacher and was successful in raising the funds to buy a house and start operating the first Dismas House. So when Dismas House first opened, basically it was a group of Vanderbilt University students, of men, living together with men coming out of prison and creating this sense of a family-like community in the house. I.e., that's where eating dinner together came from, right? They saw themselves as being like the family that they didn't have, right? So that's why it makes sense. We eat dinner together. That's what families do, right? So, and then about a year later, they're thinking, well, certainly there are women who are incarcerated who have this same need, a need for a place to live, a need for support. So they thought Dismas House then should be a place for men and women coming out of prison and living together with men and women students living in the house. And so that was successful. And then, so that was like the mid-1970s. It was the mid-1980s when we opened a house here in Burlington at this location. Actually, in Tennessee, they had already opened a house in eastern Tennessee. If you know the geography of Tennessee, Nashville is sort of right in the middle. So they had a Dismas House in eastern Tennessee and a Dismas House in Memphis, which is west Tennessee. And so we were the fourth Dismas House that opened, and actually the same year that we opened Dismas House, Dismas House in South Bend, Indiana opened up too. And they were connected with Notre Dame. We were connected mostly with University of Vermont, and St. Mike's. And then a couple years later, a house in Worcester, Massachusetts opened up. And then a couple years after that, one in Rutland. So there was a period of fairly rapid growth in that late 80s period. But we were a part of that organization from the time that we opened in 1986 until around the year 2000, when it was unfortunately the organization itself was just too small for a far-flung organization. And so houses in outside of Tennessee, for the most part, created their own organizations in their own states. For the most part, that's kind of what happened at that point. But that's how students getting involved at Dismas was not just like, hey, it would be a good idea to get some students. It was started by students. Yeah. And one of the things to me that's an amazing sort of thing that's true from that story is, that, university students opened a Dismas house, sort of invested themselves in opening this project in 1975 in Nashville, Tennessee. And from that, all these other Dismas houses have opened and have been serving people. Thousands of men and women coming out of prison have been served by Dismas House because this few group of university students, together with Father Jack, decided, hey, let's do this thing that hasn't been done, right? And to me, that's an incredible story of empowerment, of that it's like you don't have to wait until you've graduated from college to make a difference. It's like those students made an incredible difference. The reason why I was telling you the story about where the name Dismas comes from is that because there's a Saint Dismas, there are other organizations totally unrelated to this Dismas organization that started in 1975 by Father Jack Hickey, right? Yeah. Totally unrelated to that, but because they are doing some kind of like prison ministry or something with people in prison, have taken the name Dismas or have Dismas in the name of their organization. So it is important, like if you Google Dismas, you might find other Dismas organizations that are totally unrelated to us. So I think it's just important to be aware of that. The number of evening meals, over 40 years, 5 times a week for whatever, probably on average like 50 weeks a year, it numbers in the thousands, the number of evening meals that I sat at the table. And yet, whether it was after 10 years of being at Dismas or 20 years, 30 years, and even more recently, when it was time to give thanks, and it's not that I'm not saying that it's like I did this every night, but from time to time, it would dawn on me is that, we're giving thanks before the meal starts, and I think, how lucky am I that I get to be here at this table eating this dinner with you people, right? I just feel like, that's a privilege that, not that many people, have, or, it's just a really special, for me, it was just a special, it was an incredibly special thing to be able to sit down at the dinner table, even, after the number of evening meals numbered in the tens of thousands, maybe. It was that amazing to me. And but and I think that's in part the answer to, like why I would be doing it 40 years after starting. Because if something is that valuable to you and is that meaningful to you and moves you that much, why not do it for 40 years?